Well, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the Trabant video. It was a lot of fun to put together. It was interesting learning all about the Trabant's history and also the Eastern Bloc and how that whole thing came together. And during it, sometimes I find additional facts and I think it'd be useful to put them together into an extra video, and sometimes I don't. And this is one of the cases where I found some additional information, so I thought I'd share it with you. So first of all, the F8 was a car which I talked about in the video. It was sort of the forerunner of the Trabant, but there was also an F9. So the F8 launched in 1939, just before the Second World War, and the F9 was scheduled to launch in 1940. Of course that didn't happen because the whole war happened and they were busy trying to make armaments and things like that. So the F9 never really came about, but they had the design for it. So after the war, the F8 was made in East Germany, and Auto Union then scrambled to go to West Germany, and they abandoned all their factories in East Germany. And they looked around for factory space. They eventually found it, and they made the F9 as the F89, they called it, in a former armaments factory in Derendorf in 1950. So it took them 5 years to get everything together and get everything working. So the F89 was actually a pretty smart car. It had a drag factor of 0.34, which is amazingly low for the time, and probably points to Auto Union's motorsports pedigree in the 1930s with all the svelte, sleek designs they were coming up with to try and win motorsports events. So the F89 is produced in 1950, and then in 1953 it becomes the F91, and then in 1955 it becomes the F93. So basically they just iterate it and keep developing it. But of course, the East German companies also have the plans for the F9, which has now become these other cars, and maybe some of the tooling as well. And so then they start making their version of the F9. So Auto Union, who are now in West Germany, sue the East German company which is making the Trabants, or the forerunner of the Trabants, because they're making this F9 copy, and they sue them for copyright infringement. It ends up turning into not really much of a thing because the East German company gives up on that and then makes the P50 the forerunner of the Trabant. So they end up ending production of that anyway. It uses metal in a lot of its construction, and as I talk about in the video, the East German Trabant company didn't really have access to a lot of sheet metal, so that's not really in their interest anyway. So over in Auto Union land in West Germany, this car, which is a DKW, which is one of the 4 Auto Union brands, the DKW F car eventually turns into the F102 in 1964. And as you can see from what it looks like, it's starting to look more like a modern Audi. And of course, all the 4 Auto Union brands eventually they get bought by Mercedes. And then, of course, they eventually merge with Volkswagen. But they drop all the Horsch and DKW and brands, and they just focus on Audi. And of course, they become the Audi that we know today. So the Trabant wasn't the only car which the Trabant factories were making. They also made another car called the Sachsenring P240, which they launched in 1956. It was originally called the Horsch P240, but as I mentioned before, Auto Union owned the brands for Horsch and Audi and DKW, and so Auto Union over in West Germany said, you can't do that, that's our copyrighted name. And so the East German company decided that they weren't going to call it the Horsch, they called it the Sachsenring. So this was actually a brand new, all new designed car, and it was meant to be something as good as the current Mercedes, the Mercedes 220 that was out. So it was a very fancy, very expensive car. It was used by authorities, party officials, and also the main TV company for some reason. It cost 3 times the price of a Trabant. And so, very fancy car. But it was rushed to market. They wanted to launch it for the East German heads, Walter, what was his name? Walter Ulbricht. They wanted to launch it for his birthday in 1954. But there was no way they were going to be able to do that. It was just rushed to market. It took them until 1956 to get it to market, and even then they were it was unreliable because they were having all kinds of problems because they rushed it to market. So the Soviets had a lot of control over Eastern Bloc countries, and they dictated you should only have one of your countries making a luxury car. And you're all trying to do different things, and it's just not really working in this planned socialist economy that they're trying to create. So eventually they decide that the Czechoslovakian Tatra 603 would be the luxury car for the Eastern Bloc. And so P240 production ended in 1959. So moving on to the Trabant, and I mentioned in the video Trabant means satellite, but it also means companion. And I'm not sure if the double meaning was intended or not. Maybe the car was meant to be a companion for you or something like that. But anyway, there was a double meaning, so I thought I'd point that out. So the Trabant is launched in the late 1950s, and one of the first things people try and do is make it more practical. So almost as soon as it's launched, people designed small caravans for it. And you can imagine it's what, a 20 horsepower engine? Two-cylinder, two-stroke engine, and with people loaded up with people and all their luggage and a caravan behind it. It must have had awful acceleration. But, needs must, and, if that's all you've got, then that's what you'll do. If you want to go on holiday, that's what you're going to do. So later on in 1979, a guy called Gerhard Müller invents this pop-up roof tent, which I think is just fantastic. So the idea behind this tent is that when you take it with you on holiday, it's completely flat. It's just like a big flat thing on top of the roof. And then you erect it as just a regular tent on top of your car. It looks sort of dangerous. I'm surprised that you don't just take a tent with you and then just erect it next to the car. But, well, it's fun and interesting if nothing else. But it looks sort of dangerous. You have a little ladder up the back, and you go up the ladder, and then you sort of sleep in it on a little mattress. And at least with it looks sort of dangerous that you might sort of tip the car over if you're standing on one side of it. Who knows what might happen? But at least the triangle shape at least sort of persuades you to stand in the middle of the car, not on the edges. So moving on, I mentioned in the 1970s, the East German state decides to work with Czechoslovakia to create this joint car that's going to replace the Trabant, the Wartburg and the Skoda. And it's called the RGW Auto Project. I don't mention a lot of these names just because it sort of gets in the way of telling the story, just like I don't mention a lot of people in my videos because it tends to get in the way of telling the story because you're trying to remember the names of all these people, and it doesn't matter because these people sort of pop in and out of the story, just like names do. So anyway, it's called RGW Auto if you want to look it up. And the Skoda version of it was actually designed or styled by Giugiaro, the Italian designer who designed things such as the Volkswagen Golf, the Fiat Uno, Ferraris, all kinds of things like that. So they were spending a lot of money trying to make this project a go, but it was just disagreements between East Germany and Czechoslovakia and lack of money, and it just ended up going nowhere. So it was just this big waste of money that East Germany spent a lot of money on the project, and of course all that money was just down the drain. So there's a Trabant fan called Tim Keel who told me about this. He was very helpful. I don't know how I got in touch with him. Maybe he watched one of my videos. Oh, that's right. I think I put something about the Trabant, and it was because the Trabant was a video which won a community poll. And I think Tim maybe messaged me and said, "Oh, I know all these things about Trabants. If you need more information, let me know." So of course, I'm always interested if someone knows a lot about a particular car that I can maybe check a script and find out more information to try and help get things right. And he helped me a lot with some of the facts and also some of the photos, particularly the 1995 car that came back from Turkey. Because he happens to have one, or he happens to have one that's sort of one of those. Anyway, enough of that. He enlightened me to something called the Gen X scheme. And Gen X doesn't mean Generation X or Generation Y or whatever terms people use nowadays. Gen X refers to a scheme that East Germany and West Germany sort of agreed with, where West Germans could buy products for East German relatives, usually relatives. So of course, because East and West Germany are split up, but you know, people in Germany are still families, and you've got uncles and cousins who are either side of the border. And so rich, relatively rich West Germans wanted to buy things for East Germans because they were doing relatively poorly. So what would happen is you would have this catalogue, and you could pick items from the catalogue, and then you would spend your West German Deutschmarks, and then the items would appear at the doorstep of these East Germans. And it was a way for East Germany to get Western currency. And most of the products were from East Germany. So the idea is East Germany is making products and they're getting Western currency. Not all of the products were East German. Some of them were Western products, but most of them were. And it was a real incentive to do this, because not just you would get essentially stuff that you couldn't otherwise afford, but for example, you could buy a Trabant through this scheme. Now normally there's a 10, 15 year waiting list to get a Trabant in Eastern Germany. But if you did it through this scheme, this Gen X scheme, where you're buying it through this catalogue, you could get a Trabant in East Germany within 4 to 6 weeks. So there's obviously a lot of incentive to go and do this, but it really annoyed East Germans because it turned into this sort of two-class society. There's the class that know people in West Germany who are willing to buy things for them, and people in East Germany that don't know people in West Germany, or aren't getting these things from rich West Germans. So between 1967 and 1989, about 3.3 billion Deutschmarks were got for the East German economy through this. So it was a fairly big thing. It worked out quite well for East Germany. And West Germany, I think, sort of suffered it. They didn't really like it, but it was just what it was. So I was looking up more about this Gen X scheme, and on the Wikipedia page there was actually a joke about the Gen X scheme, which I thought I'd share with you. You may or may not find it funny, but anyway, here's the joke. So East German President Erich Honecker travels across the country and stops in a small town at a well-preserved group of houses. A little boy who doesn't recognize him asks, "Who are you?" The president smiles and replies, "I'm the one you owe everything here to." So the boy runs into the house and calls to his mum and says, "Mom, the man from Gen X is here." Moving on, so then we get to the late 1980s, and I'm talking about the Berlin Wall falling and the border becoming very porous, but it was quite interesting exactly how this porous border came about. So there's a guy called Miklos Nemeth, who was a Hungarian president at the time, and there's an organization called the Pan-European Union, and they agree to host this picnic on the Austria-Hungarian border in 1989, August 1989. So my first question was, what the heck is the Pan-European movement? Well, the Pan-European movement got founded in 1923 because there was a bunch of people that had this idea that Europe should be one big country, it should be unified, a unified state, and so they were there promoting it from 1923. And then, of course, it didn't get very far before the war, but after the war, it helped to form the present-day European Union. So anyway, in 1989, the president of this Pan-European Forum is Otto von Habsburg, who is not just an MEP, He's also the former Crown Prince of Austro-Hungary, whatever the country is. So he's part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's a former Crown Prince of that. So, of course, he's very interested in Austria-Hungary becoming one country again. So they decide to hold this picnic in August 1989 as a test of the Soviet response in the Gorbachev era, to see if they'll crack down and see if they'll crack down on it, or whether they'll just sort of let it happen. So it gets held, the border gets opened for 3 hours, and a whole load of people from Hungary go over the border, a whole load of people from East Germany who go to Hungary also go over the border, have this wonderful picnic, and then a lot of them don't come back because they don't want to stay in the Eastern Bloc nations. So yeah, it becomes a kind of real problem. And at the same time, this is the summer and a lot of East Germans go holidaying in Hungary, and there's like 100,000 of them there. And the Soviets want each Eastern Bloc country to essentially ship people back to their own country if they stay too long in one place. But there's 100,000 of them there, and it's too expensive to ship them home, and the Hungarian president isn't really interested in doing it anyway. So Hungary can't really sort this problem out. So essentially they stop policing the Austrian border. And so people just start leaving from Hungary through to Austria. And so this picnic eventually leads to all of these Eastern Bloc states having peaceful revolutions, which leads to the collapse of the USSR in 1991. So the pan-European movement not only shaped the common market that turns into the European Union, it also helped shape the fall of the Soviet state and the Eastern Bloc state in the 20th century. So a lot of the 20th century can be attributed to this pan-European movement that no one's ever heard of, or I certainly haven't heard of. So finally, we get to 1995, and I talk about these 500 cars that were exported to Turkey and then they didn't pay. So they took these 500 Trabants and moved them back to Germany and tried to sell them. Well, they didn't try to sell 500, they tried to sell 444 of them, because these 500 had been sitting for 4 years at a salty port and just sitting there rusting, and only 444 of them could be sold. The remaining 54 were scavenged for parts to help the other 444 actually go. Each of the cars got a paint job, but of course they were just covering up problems, and so these 444 cars were riddled with rust and just rotted away to nothing. And so very few of them are actually around today. But anyway, that's all I have for the optional extra video. Thank you for watching to the end. Thank you for watching the Trabant video. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next video.